Hello everybody, welcome to a comprehensive look at the 1.0 version of Dark Souls 1, specifically the original release from 2011, not the remaster. We are currently working backwards through the Dark Souls trilogy, meaning this is the last in that thread, but we've also reviewed Elden Ring, Demon Souls Remake, Bloodborne, and Night Rain. The goal of the video will be to show everything that's been changed between the very original print of the game versus what's in the current patched game now. These videos exclude the DLCs, as it's not content that's available yet in the 1.0 versions. If you're unaware, a 1.0 version of a game in today's context is the version of the game that was printed into the discs that were shipped to stores. And you can play this version by installing the discs straight into the console without downloading whatever online updates are available for the game. Assuming it's not a later retail version of the game that has the DLC patches already in the disc. For instance, the Prepare to Die editions might not have the true 1.0 version if it has the DLC and later updates in the disc. That's certainly the case for the PC Prepare to Die edition. For this video, I'll be using a standalone North American release of Dark Souls on the PS3 for the 1.0 run-through, and the now delisted Steam Prepare to Die edition for the current patch. I usually try to use the same copy of the game and just update it to verify changes for the highest accuracy. But long story short, which I covered more in depth in the Dark Souls 2 video, my Wi-Fi/Bluetooth module on my PS3 is broken, and I can't use the internet at the moment to update the game. But luckily, I did already own a copy of this on PC, which should be good enough for our purposes. There's certainly some pros to using a simultaneous install of the game, as I can verify changes immediately after, without needing to update and downpatch regularly. Now for full transparency, the Japanese version of this game did release a little less than 2 weeks before the North American release, and there's a few patch notes that imply there were updates before the American release, but either they're multiplayer or bug related in ways that don't affect us, or the changes mentioned are not reflected in the 1.0 version of the American release, meaning it might be as true of a 1.0 version as a Japanese copy if I were to use that one, which makes sense if they're mostly the same game build, as logistically, you need time to print out the discs and also distribute them to physical stores, and 2 weeks is probably not enough for both of those at a mass scale. Even if I did own the Japanese version, I would probably opt to mostly use the American one for the subtitles and text anyway. For researchers that used to help me research outside of my own game knowledge, I did heavily rely on Dark Souls Future Press Guide for the original game as a cross-reference, and also the remastered one, as in some ways it helps get a picture of a few of the main new changes if I can spot them in the maps they have ahead of time, though I made sure not to get my wires crossed for the few remaster-only changes, like the Vamos Bonfire, which is remaster exclusive. There are loads and loads of websites online talking about the 1.0 version, so I made sure to write down as many changes as I could find, which I'll be providing the source for in the description. The Wikidoc came in really clutch for this in particular. I have also watched the Mr. Metagross video in the past, so I just went ahead and rewatched it and wrote down anything that wasn't already documented in the prior websites. And for those new entries, I'll put a little shiny Metagross on the upper left, especially if there's a good chance I would have missed that specific detail otherwise. When I'm showing footage of the changes present in the 1.0 version that differ from what is currently available through updates, I will have a label saying 1.00 in the top right corner of the video. And when showing footage of the current patch, which will be the PC game, there will be a current label in the top right corner as well. If I skip through something that you're wondering about, like a major boss or something, it just means I didn't find any specific difference, so I didn't mention it. You're welcome to comment about any particular thing you're curious about, of course. Alright, that should be all. Let's get into it. The first change noted was that the starting equipment load maximum for all starting classes was increased. For instance, the max capacity of the Knight class to reach 100% burden is 44 units in 1.0, and it was increased to 50 units at some point by a current patch. This is what all the starting classes increase was. It's pretty clear that it was a 6-point increase across the board. It's worth noting that equip load is tied to endurance, so if any class shared the same endurance, then the equip load will be the same as well. I know he just started, but there's already one documented change that I'm skeptical about, though I figured I should discuss it anyway. According to patch notes and stuff, all roll speeds were buffed from 1.0, allegedly especially medium roll, but when putting them side by side, I didn't spot any differences. Supposedly the recovery speed of them is faster, but I don't see it myself from my testing. Obviously this doesn't show the invincibility frames, so there's a chance that's what was buffed, but that's certainly way more difficult to test without being able to see the frame data. The responsiveness of the lock-on target switch was improved. In 1.0, the switch was delayed by a tiny bit that definitely makes it feel a little clunky, probably really detrimental for range users. And as you can see, it's a lot more snappy in current patch. This is a famous one, maybe the poster child of the original release of Dark Souls. When you light a bonfire, the splash text that pops up on screen says, "You lit the bonfire" in 1.0, where it got changed to just "bonfire lit" by the time of the current patch. There are more splash text changes, we'll discuss them as they first show up. Apparently some of the console versions of this game never had these changed, or it took longer to be updated, so it's possible some version you own may still have this. Fun additional fact, apparently the traditional Chinese translation of the remaster on Steam still has these, and you can change it to that pretty easily, so that's another way to see this yourself if you'd like. In 1.0, you can't do what we call a setup parry, meaning that if you're blocking, you can't initiate a parry maneuver until you let go. This is also how it works in Demon Souls. In fact, if you try to parry while blocking, it seems to pretty consistently queue up a parry after you do let go. So if you're actually going to parry in combat, make sure to have fully let go of the block so you don't throw out a mistimed parry. In current patch, you can do the setup parry while blocking, which is extra handy for PvP. One of the more famous balance updates was that the soul yield for loads of enemies and bosses got increased. However, it's not for all enemies, nor was it consistent. It varies per enemy. For instance, the basic hollow enemies yield 20 souls in both 1.0 and current patch, but the hollow soldiers a little deeper into the asylum dropped 50 souls in 1.0, and then it was increased to 80 at some point. Allegedly the HP and poise of some enemies was decreased, also for balance, but there's definitely a lot more spotty to get an exact number count without external totals. Finally defeating the Asylum Demon, we get to see another splash text change, where it says, "You defeated" in 1.0, then it was changed to "Victory achieved." The demon only drops the key to leave the Asylum in 1.0, where they will later include a humanity into its drops. Lastly, it only yields 1000 souls in 1.0, where it will drop 2000 by current patch, doubling it in this case. The additional item drop is going to be a recurring thing going forward for bosses, as all of them only drop their soul and a key item if applicable, but I won't be detailing that or every single yield increase going forward. Instead, I made a Google spreadsheet detailing the version yield comparison, including the boss drops, for every single enemy type in the game. Yes, you heard that right. Every single enemy type. You're welcome. It'll be in the description, of course. Just note that the biggest increases are usually for bosses, especially the early game ones. Finally leaving the freaking tutorial area, we are able to level for the first time, and in the level up menu, you may notice that the required souls tab says 0? Unfortunately, it doesn't mean you can level up for free. It's just that in 1.0, it'll tell you how many souls you're about to spend for levels you're gaining, which might sound fine in theory, but it's very unhelpful. You have no idea how many souls you need if you're going to level again, so thankfully by current patch they changed it, and it tells you the actual required soul amount. A welcome change. There aren't many changes in terms of item locations and the like for this game, but right here in Firelink, the well contains only 1 humanity, where in current patch, this got increased to holding 3. Due to the bosses very rarely dropping items, naturally, you'll end up with way less humanity in the 1.0 version, so this was likely to offset that a bit more, even with the bosses having additions later. And given you don't receive a humanity from Asylum Demon, giving you 3 would at least encourage you to at least try out using humanity starting off. Speaking of which, when you reverse hollowing in the 1.0 version, the splash text says you revived to human, where it will now say humanity restored. A lot of these original texts are technically fine grammatically, but they're certainly a little awkward. This is going to sound familiar for the Dark Souls 2 video watchers. The Thorlon Talisman was changed from D scaling and Faith in 1.0 to a C scaling by the time of current patch. There's plenty of things to talk about in this game, so I didn't collect nor will I go over every single weapon like this, besides a few noteworthy exceptions, but it's safe to say it's likely there were plenty of balance changes like this. The weapon list isn't too expansive in this game. If y'all are interested, I could certainly consider going over all the weapons and catalysts at a later time, and catalog it in the Google spreadsheet as well. Before heading into Undead Burg, we have a good opportunity to show something that will be coming up later as well. The enemy aggro range. It's a well-known quirk of this game that enemies have a further reaching aggro range, in a way that definitely can become more overwhelming and be more prone to ganking. There's a perfect way to demonstrate this right here in Firelink. The enemy in the back that's further than the one closer to you will aggro a lot earlier than it will in the current patch. Now this is not to say that enemy aggro is generally worse in this version. A lot of ambushes and the like still work throughout the game, so my guess is that they manually went through some enemies and reduced whatever line of sight parameters they thought was a little excessive. Allegedly the leashing of enemies is also a lot more unforgiving, and I did some testing for this, but I didn't really see much difference. although that's definitely a lot harder to test as well, so I figured I'd mention it just in case. Over in the Undead Burg, the male Undead merchant doesn't sell a bottomless box in 1.0. We will find loads of wares missing from a lot of vendors that were added later, even some things that were very handy and you probably frequented in your standard playthrough when going through the game now. From this merchant you can buy a rapier and a spear, which is perfect to showcase that in 1.0, the stamina consumption when you turtle poke through a shield is much less than in current patch. It seems to me like the 1.0 consumption is pretty much on par with just normally attacking, which is definitely a little overpowered, especially when you have more stamina. When you defeat a Black Knight, you have to loot the drops from the ground instead of being directly placed in inventory like in current patch. And the same goes for Crystal Lizards. I'm pretty sure I saw through my playthrough that if one of those enemies falls off a cliff and properly dies, the loot won't respawn at the original spot if you quit out. You just straight up lose it. So it makes sense that these non-respawning enemies will be changed to auto-drop their stuff later on, especially the lizards. Sure, it makes it easier to bait the enemies to fall off a ledge than defeating them, but it's a lesser evil over just losing the item if they happen to fall off. This is one of the changes that Mr. Metagross talks about that there's a chance I might have missed, and it's partly related to the enemy aggro again. But these halls that drop from the roof above can close the door in this room, where no matter how hard I try to replicate this in current patch, no enemy closed the door. It's possible it's not strictly 1.0, but the fact that I can replicate this in 1.0 and not current is telling. In my original playthrough of the 1.0 version, I had a bug where I didn't have the second crossbow archer spawn in the balcony behind you during the Taurus demon fight, but it would appear again when I went far enough into the bridge. This is definitely a bug because when I came back in like New Game Plus, it would be there from the start. Maybe it was a cache issue or something, but that aside, the location of this magician over here is different. As in 1.0, it's standing at the top of the ladder, where it got moved to the side in current patch. My guess as to why they moved this enemy is that when it tries to fire you in the bridge, this crossbow guy is very likely to just hit the top of the ladder, depending on your position. Or maybe they didn't feel it was fair to have them right at the top of the ladder. Perhaps both. The change of the Taurus Demon crossbow enemy position has been documented in a lot of the resources I browsed, but there's another enemy position change shortly after that I don't think I saw anyone discuss. In 1.0, the 5 hollow soldiers in the Hellkite Bridge are all pretty much right next to the stairway that leads back to the Burg bonfire, where in current patch, they moved 3 of them backwards into the bridge, closer to the Hellkite perching spot. I think the reasoning is pretty clear. Having them all right next to the stairway is needlessly obstructive for trying to reach the shortcut after a boss, especially with a Drake that's about to rain down fire on you, and just a nuisance when trying to get back up from the shortcut when they're just going to get killed by the Drake anyway. We'll be showcasing this with the character being a little deeper into the playthrough, but apparently you need to have a whole 50 faith to be able to join the Sunlight Covenant here in the Sunlight Altar 1.0, where the requirement was reduced to 25. Now it might seem unreasonable at its face, but the reason for this is that the value is reduced by 5 faith levels every time you help someone beat a boss in co-op, potentially lowering it pretty quickly, especially given Solaire just gave you a soapstone. I assume this is still how it works in current patch as well, but the problem for us in 1.0 version is you can't play online to reduce this requirement at all, so you just have to reach 50. Having collected our first greatsword of the game, in the Claymore, we were able to show that the two-handed greatsword R1 recovery speed was lower in 1.0 than it is in current patch, meaning that the attack is nerfed by it becoming slower. Now that I have died and am able to show this off, recovering your lost souls from the bloodstain displays the text "You recovered," changed to just "retrieval" in current. Definitely among the most awkward translations. I had a lucky hollow soldier shield drop, which is perfect as apparently a lot of medium shield stability were nerfed, and this is one of the most noteworthy examples, going from 60 stability to 56, which is apparently even more noteworthy when fully upgraded, along with fire defenses being decreased a bit too. It's not every single medium shield that was nerfed, but a handful were, in order to allow for great shields to shine a bit more. Andre doesn't sell any arrows or bolts, which, spoiler alert, is going to be a recurring theme, but luckily that's all the differences in his stock. He still sells the toolboxes and tie knot charts, for instance. Finally, encountering the Bell Gargoyles, similar to the Black Knights and Lizards, tail weapon drops had to be picked up, where they are auto-dropped into your inventory later on, possibly for the same reason if you can only obtain one from the first tail sever, and maybe end up dying before you can loot it. I feel like I noticed that in 1.0, the second gargoyle isn't as prone to breathing fire as they would be in current patch. I'm always hesitant in claiming things like this because I'd either take looking into the code or doing hours of testing, but that's just an assessment after letting the gargoyle live for a while. Checking Oswald's stock, the Purging Stone costs 4,000 souls in 1.0, where they were reduced to 3,000 for current patch. Similarly, the indictment goes from 2,000 souls to 200, although not that it matters much for us in 1.0. He also doesn't sell Homeward Bones in 1.0 when they're added by current patch. I suspect this is partly why the gargoyles don't drop one after defeat even in current, since they just gave you a vendor with an infinite amount. Lastly, for Oswald, the amount you have to pay to have sin forgiven is much more punishing in 1.0. I had to pay 26,000 souls at level 13, and after doing the math, that means that the amount is found by multiplying your level by 2,000. For comparison, in current patch, at level 17 I had to pay 8,500, yielding a formula of level times 5,000 instead. Given you receive far less souls in 1.0, this value was definitely way more punishing for it to be realistic that someone would use this mechanic, although even for current patch it'd be a bit much to pay 26,000. By this point I did the Undead Asylum revisit, and the only other difference isn't quite a change, but a glitch. Or at least you can assume it's a glitch from several context clues, including the fact that it obviously got patched. If you put down an item that Snuggly the Crow accepts for a trade, reload the game, then before looting the new item, you drop another of the same item, and only then you loot the reward, you can quit out once again and reload for another of the exact reward. You can repeat this process indefinitely to the point where if you run out of the item you need to drop, you can simply leave the dropped item there, leave the area to collect more, return, then drop more of the items before looting the reward, to continue the process. Most of the rewards are redundant to do this for, but it can be easily abused for upgrade materials. We know this is a glitch because if you don't do this process correctly and end the loop, or if you try to do it now in current patch, Snuggly will tell you she doesn't want more of that item. So the implication obviously being that she only wants one of each item. So yeah, don't try this in current. You just lose the item you dropped. From there I took a look at the Darkroot Basin and Garden shortly after. And from here I was able to free Dusk and spawn the Antiquated set. For whatever reason, the skirt is extremely overpowered defense-wise, outclassing the Knight Armor leggings easily, but obviously the weight unit is far lower. Naturally the defenses were nerfed at some point, matching closer to the rest of the set. Speaking of Knight Armors, the Elite Knight Armor was buffed and nerfed in its defenses all over the place. I'm not even going to try to detail a pattern, I'll just show all the stats side by side, so you can see for yourself. On the NPC summoning window, the word name is placed to the left of the summon's name, where it doesn't have that in current patch. The Moonlight Butterfly doesn't initiate their boss music or show their health bar until it finishes flying down. And when defeated, it's normal for the butterfly not to drop anything but their soul, but you do get a Homeward Bone at the blacksmith's petrified corpse in the tower, and in 1.0 that's not present even there. Scooting over to the graveyard in Firelink, the skeleton doesn't yield any souls whatsoever, where they at least yield 50 in current patch. This will be a recurring detail with other enemies deeper into the game, namely slimes, mosquitoes, and ghosts, but I won't be mentioning them every time, just putting them all here. Inside the Catacombs proper, they placed a message underneath this breakable wall as a hint by the time of current patch, where there wasn't one in 1.0. The same goes for this ladder that leads to the Tranquil Walk of Peace, which, given I couldn't find this spell for a long time, maybe that was a good idea. Speaking of Tranquil Walk of Peace, I had to test this way later of course, as there's no NPC type enemies near, but this spell originally lasted 30 seconds, and it got nerfed down to about 10 or 11 seconds by current patch. The effective range is also much wider, I want to say about double what it is in current patch, where it's only about the ring that is formed around you. And lastly, allegedly the burden created from the spell got reduced from 100% to 50, but when applying this to NPCs of varying roll speeds, they all seem to react the same. In other words, only being able to slow walk and unable to roll. Unsure if this doesn't apply to NPCs and only multiplayer opponents and whatnot, but my testing didn't bear much fruit in this regard. Vamos isn't a vendor at all in 1.0, he only offers the blacksmithing services, where he would offer something as a current patch. The summon Leroy does seem to do noticeably less damage to Pinwheel compared to current. Mr. Metagross theorized it might be that summons got buffed, but I did check a few other summons' damage across the game, and that was still consistent. So I think it's more so that Pinwheel specifically might have had their HP adjusted, which would add up with the prior mentions of HP balance. When leaving the Catacombs, I noticed that this path backwards from Pinwheel also had an added message that wasn't there in 1.0. Naturally, so players can find the way back more easily, especially given the darkness and if they don't have the Lord Vessel yet. Returning to the Undead Burg, for the lower segment, the female undead merchant sells homeward bones for 800 souls instead of 500. Devastatingly, given the depths are coming up, she doesn't sell purging stones. This was only added later on for current patch, for understandable reasons. She also doesn't sell the, let's say, generic arrow and bolts that most merchants will at least eventually sell. She only carries her own unique arrow stock. After buying Magic Shield from Griggs and using it, the duration in 1.0 is about 25 seconds, whereas in current patch, it was reduced to about 15. Over in the depths, this is the first time it is confirmed pretty easily, but the less non-respawning enemy drops that are unique loot rule doesn't apply in 1.0 it seems, because the Butcher Ladies did not drop the SAG headpiece, meaning the item is just lost as an option until New Game Plus. If you didn't know, by the time of current patch, the game guarantees that you'll be receiving this item after killing the second one if the first one didn't drop it, and it works that way for all enemies in similar circumstances. After killing the Invader Kirk, our first invader, we can see that retrieving the humanity on the bloodstain yields a text, "You got humanity," where that got changed to humanity retrieved. Domino also doesn't sell the generic arrow and bolt stock, the usual. When I summoned Solaire and Latrak again after a death to Gaping Dragon, I noticed that I couldn't skip the boss cutscene at all in 1.0, despite being offline NPCs, and not online in general. In current patch you can't skip it, even if it takes a few seconds for it to go through. Maybe just a quirk to make you feel like these are real players, where it takes them a second to all skip the cutscene eventually. Now before we leave the depths, one of the changes I'm sure you've heard of if you're informed of this version, being inflicted with curse is far more dangerous, as in the 1.0 version, you can actually have cursing stack, meaning that if you get cursed again while already cursed, your health will be cut in half once more. This goes as far as 4 curse debuffs, meaning you'll be at a 16th of your total health. So yeah, be careful. Before proceeding, I'll be doing the rest of Darkroot Garden in order to have the samurai and ninja guys spawn in Blighttown. Real quick though, talking to Laurentis and receiving the Pyromancy Flame, I noticed that the weapon type text in the description has the text overlap with other menu text. This is obviously fixed by current patch, but it's actually a consistent issue for other weapons with long names, like Ultra Greatsword, which ended up being shortened to Old Greatsword. Buying Iron Flesh from him too, in 1.0 this Pyromancy is much more busted. It has the attack bouncing property as you'd expect, but it appears to just give you a flat damage boost as well, making you pretty tough to defeat. In current patch, the sheer feature of the bouncing helps with survivability, but the damage is a lot more to deal with. Now proceeding to the garden, you can't lock onto the invisible ghost NPC hunters here, where you can do so in current patch. This is apparently how the fog ring used to, or was meant to work at first in PvP and such, but of course I can't exactly test that. Some of the hunters are intended to not respawn after being killed, so in current patch these 2 knights and the Ferris NPCs don't respawn at all after the first kill, while the rest remain. In 1.0, as you can assume, they do respawn, and deal a pretty good amount of souls, so I feel like this is a good farm spot for a version where souls are hard to come by. Shiva of the East's ninja bodyguard placement is different in 1.0 version versus current patch, right here in the Darkroot Garden. He's just a little further from the ledge in current. They probably moved them so you don't get any silly ideas, or if you just knocked them off on accident, which probably wouldn't get you the ring even if you tried in 1.0 anyway. The Hornet Ring's crit modifier is higher in 1.0. From testing myself, I went from 308 damage to 462, a 1.5 times multiplier, when in current it went from 270 to 352, equating to 1.3 times. Now onto Blighttown. Similar to prior examples, you have to loot the blow dart enemy drops from the ground when defeated, where they auto dropped in your inventory later on. Similar to the medium shield thing, the Eagle shield used to have 100% stability, then it got nerfed slightly. Although this is a great shield, it is made of wood and does weigh much less than other shields in the same class, so it just outclassed other great shields too much for how little it weighed in comparison. Quelaag only drops her soul in 1.0, where she drops a Twinkle Humanity when defeating her, and a Homeward Bone after ringing the bell. Okay, now I finally obtained the Darkwood Grain Ring, or the Ninja Flip Ring, so now's the time to talk about a very infamous change. Originally at launch, you could obtain the flip from this ring even when you're just below 50% burden, which is mid-roll, meaning that you could reasonably easily have good armor and do the best roll in the entire game. And that includes things like the full stone armor or full Havel, for instance. So it was absolutely busted for PvP reasons, but even for PvE I imagine. After a certain patch, you'd have to have a fast roll, or at least 25%, to be able to take advantage of it. Far more reasonable. Now right away we're going to talk about another huge change from 1.0, but this time it's a glitch. We venture down the Great Hollow, reach Ash Lake, and obtain the dragon head from the stone dragon. There's a glitch you can learn and perform that has been patched, where if you trick the game into thinking you're using the dragon head for the fire, and then switch to another consumable item in your scroll menu, it'll instead use the item indefinitely, even if you only have one, until you let go of the button. So items that don't have prompts like souls can be used indefinitely for as long as you want. Humanity is another very useful item for this. And it will consume that single item, so if you don't want to fully lose it, maybe store some of them in the bottomless box if you have more than one. It is a tiny bit more complicated than I described, but not by much. I'm not going to teach the exact procedure of the glitch here, I'll just link the video that I used to learn it, in case you want to try it yourself at some point. Finally, before returning up above, the Dragon Greatsword got a buff from 1.0 to current patch, going from 360 damage starting out to 390. Presumably this snowballs a bit with upgrades too, but it's only a rare buff in this case. When you ring the 2 bells, Dunma will move to Firelink, and normally he sells the master key here, but at 1.0 he doesn't sell it at all. So pretty much the only way to get it is if you choose it as a starting gift, or if you start as a thief. Although in all fairness, this key is borderline useless by the time you get it from him, since most of the doors it unlocks are before Sense Fortress. Feeding Fram things yields different salt amount depending on the items. For instance, most consumables and upgrades are 100, even rubbish. This comes later of course, but even the small soul doesn't give only 1 soul. It's just the default amount seemingly. I won't be detailing every single change. Same as the weapons thing from earlier. If y'all would want, I could catalog the items in a spreadsheet, but otherwise this is just a blanket entry change. Over in Sense Fortress, in 1.0 the 2 snakes near Siegmeyer are alive when you arrive, where in current patch, I guess the implication is that he defeated them before sitting down. But obviously the practical reason is so Siegmeyer won't accidentally be hit or killed if they attack you or you fight them. Some of the arrows from the ground plates don't have their texture applied properly, resulting in them just being a red cylinder. This is inconsistent, sometimes the same trap will show properly and others don't, so it's only an occasional bug rather than just them forgetting to apply them entirely. And there's a detail here and there. Sometimes when you buy items from a vendor, they'll still give you the dialogue as if you haven't bought anything, which is quite funny. It may be that I bought something, then opened the menu again and didn't buy anything that time. This is another blanket change, since otherwise there would be too many details to name, but apparently elemental infused weapons are generally better, and it's very well displayed by the lightning spear, which you find from the mimic here in Sense. Here's a comparison of the usage from both characters, as elemental weapons got nerfed at some point. Although this is a very pitiful test, apparently the Soul Mass type spells got nerfed at some point, and I can showcase it here by using the homing Soul Mass with barely met requirements and the same staff on both characters. In 1.0 it did 60 damage with the 2 spheres, meanwhile it was 54 in current. I'm sure the amount snowballs as more masses spawn when you level further. Finally over in Anor Londo, if you acquire the Silver Knight's sword, you may notice that the weapon landing attacks imbues the enemy with a lightning effect. Now, according to the stats of the weapon, it shouldn't actually inflict lightning damage, it's labeled at 0, so it's definitely interesting. This game doesn't have the lightning bonus damage on water like later games, so I'm not really sure how to test if it genuinely does lightning damage, or if it's just a superficial property. You can't buff this weapon for the same reason, whereas they removed the lightning from current patch, and in this version you can actually buff it. The Blacksmith Giant doesn't sell any upgrade materials originally, which is definitely incredibly inconvenient, because that means that something like large Titanite shards, you'll need to backtrack to the vendor in Sense Fortress. But you're actually in trouble if you need more Twinkling Titanite, because no other vendor sells them in this game, unless you're okay with the Snuggly glitch. He also doesn't sell the boxes, nor the generic arrows and bolts, these were added later on. While we're here, this is the perfect time to talk about a very overpowered weapon, which if you don't know about it, I bet you never expect. The Crystal Ring Shield. If you didn't know, this shield has an attack where it summons a magical ring that you can hurl like a chakram. And in 1.0, this weapon could be very overpowered, especially when you fully upgrade it to +5. The trick here is that the damage is actually based off of your right hand weapon, similar to move swap. So if you have a high damage weapon in your right hand, like an Ultra Greatsword, you can essentially do the damage of that weapon at range, and you only need to be aware of the shield's durability. As you didn't expect, the right hand weapon thing was a bug, and it got patched later on to not act this way, and just generally doesn't do nearly as much damage. Onto Ornstein and Smo, I noticed that Smoke's charge has the chance of being a double hit, causing a lot more damage, where as much as I tried to replicate it, and from my memory, in current patch you usually only take 1. I think the reason is that in 1.0, the hammer or body touching you during the actual charge doesn't knock you down. You only get a soft stagger, which can lead into the uppercut. where by current patch they change it so you get fully knocked down even if you just get touched by the charge, giving you those iframes on the ground. As Mr. Metagross points out in their video, the Leo ring will be dropped simply by killing Ornstein first, where you can loot it off the ground, when by current patch you will only get after defeating Super Ornstein. And you can do this again if you quit out or die, and get another Leo ring, meaning that you can get multiple ones in one Yugen cycle. You can't stack them, so it's pretty useless, unless you want to trade it to another player, which will require you to up-patch from here. After obtaining the Lord Vessel, we finally have the ability to warp, of course, and this lets us discuss the fact that there's less warpable bonfires in your warp menu. From the ones we already unlocked, they added Undead Parish and the Depths bonfires, but there will be more a little later on, so we'll bring this up when we finish getting them all. Now we're going to explore the Painted World, and in here occasionally I found a red Engorged Hollow, but it's not a consistent enemy spawn. It seems random and will despawn if you quit out. I think I also read that maybe the pinwheels or the phalanxes could be red, but it never happened to me specifically. This feels like maybe a teaser into the graveyarding mechanic or something, but if not, it's just a very bizarre addition that obviously doesn't happen anymore. These enemies inflict more damage on you, but have the same amount of health and yield the same amount of souls. Priscilla only drops her soul, where in current patch it drops it to humanity, and then popping out of the painting gives you a homeward bone. Lastly, for Dark Anor Londo, the Darkmoon soldiers before the Ornstein Small Room respawn even when defeated, although only when you travel or die. You can't just rust at a bonfire. In current patch, they just don't respawn at all. Commencing the Lord Soul Seeking, and starting with Duke's Archives, there's no Crystal Golem at the beginning here, as obviously you don't have access to the DLC quite yet during the launch of base Dark Souls, where they added it later on to drop the pendant. I also learned that if you are playing the current patch, but don't own the DLC, the Crystal Golem will still be there, but apparently only drops blue chunks upon defeat, just as an additional fun fact. On the first Seath encounter, it takes a lot longer for Seath to start doing the nearly undodgeable crystal attack that doesn't cause cursing, just damage. It seemed to be after 4 normal crystal breaths, when it only takes 2 in current patch. This is another change that I can't say with 100% certainty. I'm pretty sure for current it's consistent that it's only 2, but I might have gotten lucky in some way in 1.0. If it is an intentional change, it's likely to reduce the chance that you will be cursed if unprepared, especially if you don't see the fact that you can leave the fog gate. The final splash text change in the video: if you offset curse with a rare ring of sacrifice, in 1.0 it'll say ring curse revived, when it got changed to rare ring revival. Upon finding and testing the strong magic shield, the duration of it got lowered from 25 seconds to 15, just like the lesser version. The stamina reduction from blocking a hit is reduced, but these are not even the most interesting changes, as this spell is entirely bugged in 1.0, and it literally makes you undamageable by enemy hits and the like. You won't take any direct damage. Obviously this was fixed later on. Similar to the Catacombs, they added a developer note to the invisible pathways at some point to help you along, when they weren't there at all in 1.0. This isn't a change per se, as Seath's tail cut has been the same so far, you still have to loot it from the ground, but I gotta say it's far more annoying to loot the Moonlight Greatsword because of how much Seath's tail moves around. Now we'll be moving on to the Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith, which combined has one of the highest density of unique changes, perhaps predictably given the apparent half-bake of this area. Before that though, it's a good time to upgrade the Pyromancy Flame for all their related questlines, and although they both start at the base magic adjust of exactly a 100, the attack power increase from each upgrade is higher in 1.0 than it is in current patch. For the first 15 upgrades, you get almost exactly 10 point increase for 1.0, where it's closer to 5 per in current. So they kind of flip in the Ascended upgrades, where you get more damage output from current, but it's not enough to even come close to matching the final power at plus 5, Ascended. Here's a complete comparison for each upgrade on screen now. Pause if you'd like to have a closer look at the breakdown. The damage you receive from being directly in lava is lower in 1.0, and that includes with the orange shard ring later on, making getting these items early a little more reasonable. Fun fact as well, Strong Magic Shield does negate the damage from lava entirely, even when it doesn't for things like fall damage, which is very useful in some ways. The Goldhand Black set was nerfed from 1.0 to current, as it was also pretty strong. Maybe not as much as the antiquated skirt, but funnily enough the skirt was also quite strong in its own right. I think FromSoft might think that skirts are made of iron or something, like that one Monster Hunter skirt. The first lesser Capra demon you encounter, you may be used to being where the lava used to be, but at 1.0 was originally in the archway area, a little further back. If I had to guess why they moved them from the archway, it might be for the Kirk invasion that spawns near there. Maybe they didn't want you to potentially be fighting both the demon and Kirk. There's also a Capper Demon near the second bonfire in Demon Ruins in 1.0, whereas in current patch, well, the only Capper Demon unaccounted for is the one that's near the boss fog, as that one isn't there in 1.0 at all. Definitely odd placements, but you can assume they didn't want to leave a Capper Demon near the bonfire. Not much to mention with 2 bosses coming up, except that getting the Orange Charmed Ring from the appendage cuts actually does auto-drop it to your inventory. Okay, so this change technically goes in the longer enemy aggro thing that I mentioned earlier, but this is pretty much the epitome and worst case scenario of it. The Undead Dragon Butts have the capability of seeing you and aggroing to you in what's supposed to be the safest paths in 1.0, making it inevitable that you will be attacked without maybe additional tools like the Fog Ring. When in current patch you can avoid nearly all of them if you're careful. Fighting them is horrendous and not intuitive, their hitbox are ass, and they have a few really quick attacks like a Trample Stomp, which if the first connects and you're still near, you're stuck to make contact with all 3. It's awful. If you play this version and want to take them out, I would recommend running into either of the 2 illusory wall rooms, or the roof above the second, and sniping them to aggro them. They hurt each other, so if you bait several into the same spot, they will pretty much just take each other out. It's not as bad as it seems if you play like this, but it's not fun either way. I can fully understand why they tweak their vision a bit. Apparently in 1.0, you can't open the 30 humanity shortcut to Lost Izalith near the Daughter of Chaos bonfire from the other side. You have to do the 30 humanity donation to Fair Lady to get it to open at all. Which at that rate, maybe you could just skip a lot of the Demon Ruins at that point if you want to open it already. But I can see why they opted to make it purely optional for shortcut purposes by the time of current patch. Although fun fact, this door will open again in New Game Plus if you already donated the 30 in New Game. Since I was already going to do it for the purposes of opening the door, I went ahead and checked the changes in the stat upgrades from having soft humanity, as apparently it got tweaked as well. For instance, in 1.0 each humanity gives you less item discovery per, but it also caps at 30 instead of 10, and they both cap at the same item discovery number. So the current patch rate is much higher per humanity, making each more valuable. Here's a breakdown of all the humanity item discovery changes. And secondly, the defense bonus you get from having soft humanity is also reduced from 1.0 to current patch. Since this can go all the way up to 99, I won't be detailing all of them, but here's the first few just so you can get an idea of how much, all without armor, but different levels, just for context. Over in the Tomb of the Giants, there isn't many changes until you obtain the weapon Grant from Leroy, where the scaling changed again but in a unique way. As in 1.0 the weapon had an A in dexterity and no faith scaling, and that got changed to be an A in faith but no dex scaling. This is definitely giving typo, as Grant doesn't really present as a dexterous weapon, and obviously there's a heavy faith element in Leroy generally. In the Nido fight, the skeleton and the arenas don't drop souls in 1.0, including the giant ones, where they do in current patch. After Nido, patches finally became a vendor, so I can talk about the masks freely. The Mask of the Father raises your equip burden by 1.5 times in 1.0, where it got reduced to 1.05 times by current patch. The Mask of the Mother raises your health by 1.15 times as well in 1.0, but got reduced to 1.1 times in current. The Mask of the Child's stamina recovery remained the same between versions. By now we have unlocked all the bonfires in the base game, so we can finish talking about the rest of the bonfire orb points that weren't in the originally released version. And those would be the Painted World, Duke's Archives, Crystal Caves, and the Tomb of the Giant bonfire. You may have also noticed that these bonfires were added at the bottom of the warp menu, which actually answers a long-standing question I had about the list order of these warp points. I was always baffled by the order of some of these, but if they were only added at a later point, maybe they just put them at the bottom to avoid any weird bugs with warping. Finally going to New Londo Ruins, Ingward doesn't sell transient curses, so you're at the mercy of the few you can find in this level, and any drops you get from enemies, which honestly isn't too bad, but it doesn't hurt to have the option in current patch. When Dark Raids grab you, they don't suck out your humanity in 1.0, where obviously that's a classic feature of them in the Dark Hand in current patch, although we'll note that the player Dark Hand can still suck out humanity from NPCs. This seems the best time to point it out, as in 1.0 I didn't really get any Titanite chunks from Dark Raids, where I did get a few in current patch. The implication being that allegedly the drop rates of enemies were adjusted, likely increased, but it may vary per enemy and loot type, as I didn't really notice any major changes outside of this. When Beatrice falls into the abyss, she takes fall damage in 1.0, where obviously she does it in current patch, at least for me this time. Could also be a bug, who knows. The 4 Kings only took about 20 seconds to spawn in the next one in 1.0, where at least for the first one in each case, it took 30ish seconds in current. If consistent, this means that the fight can overwhelm you more in 1.0 much more quickly. Similar to the Dark Wraiths, the 4 Kings grab doesn't suck humanity from you compared to current patch. Alright, This is it, on the final stretch. When you fill the Lord Soul, you only reach a cap of 10 flasks when resting, when by current patch you will get 20 when full. It starts out at 10 in current, and I'm not sure how many souls you'll increase to both 15 or 20, if there is a threshold at all, but that's a current patch detail anyway, so it doesn't matter for this video. There was no difference with Gwen or either of the endings, so the last detail of the game is that although the credit duration is the exact same, they go noticeably faster in current patch, presumably because it added DLC credits, like the voice actors and the like. So yeah, that's all the changes I could find with a very thorough look at Dark Souls 1's 1.0 version. I was actually pleasantly surprised with how many changes there were compared to the other Dark Souls games, but given it's potentially the most infamous 1.0 version of the FromSoft lineup, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. I do think there's a few things I talked about that weren't discussed at all online, so I hope even if you know this version like the back of your hand that you learned something new. In my personal opinion, this is actually a very interesting version of the game and still very playable. When you read through people's thoughts online, loads of folks made it seem like it's an unrelenting version that is borderline unplayable, and I will certainly not recommend it for the first time players or anything, but if you're a vet of the series, I would actually thoroughly recommend you try it out if you can. It's just more unbalanced in some ways, but likewise you can use some of the bugs at your disposal to offset it if it gets hairy. The only part I don't like at all that's different is Lost Izalith, but even they can manage to be played smart and patiently. The thing that stands out the most is that it's actually very finished, unlike some 1.0 versions like Elden Ring, which seems a lot more apt for the time, since I feel like it was only after this time frame that developers started using day 1 patches as a crutch to literally finish and complete games after they were already shipped, where this one was mostly just balancing and some bug fixes. This certainly makes me curious how Demon Souls will be when examined thoroughly, since that one had more time to develop if I understand the timeline correctly. However, we will be looking at Sekiro first. We have gotten some Dustbloods news by now with the network test. With that in mind, in the Elden Ring Switch 2 version, I estimate that we're looking at a Q4 release for Dustbloods, meaning we should have time to finish off the 1.0 series before then, but even if not, I'll certainly get started on Sekiro right away regardless. But for now, I do have Dark Souls 3, Dark Souls 2, Elden Ring, Demon Souls Remake, Bloodborne, and Night Rain videos already up if you're interested in those. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you around. Take care.